The auctioneer's gavel came down on 160 acres of Nebraska dirt for $12, and the woman who bought it hadn't touched a shovel in 15 years. Nobody in the room clapped. Nobody ever did at a county tax auction. But every head turned when the clerk read the name on the winning bid slip out loud. Odessa Hale. The same last name as the dead man who used to own it. That's the hook. Now let's get into why a grown woman would pay $12 for her own father's grave of a farm, and why, 3 weeks later, she'd be standing in the rain with a crowbar, trying to break into a barn that hadn't been opened since Nixon was president. If you're new here, this channel tells true-to-life stories about American land, American families, and the secrets buried in both, so stick around. Because by the end of this one, you're going to understand something about seed corn that most farmers half your age don't even know. And if stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe before we start, because you don't want to miss what's coming next week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Odessa Hale hadn't spoken to her father in 27 years when the letter came. Not a phone call, not an email. A letter, typed on a county letterhead, informing her that Walton Hale had died of a heart attack in his sleep in April, that the farm outside Ansel Creek, Nebraska had gone unpaid on taxes for going on 6 years, and that unless a family member stepped forward, the whole 160 acres house, barn, and all would be sold at public auction to cover the debt. She almost threw the letter away. She was 38 years old, living in a rented duplex in Omaha, working the day shift at a feed supply warehouse, and she did not need a dead man's problems following her into a life she'd worked hard to build without him. But there was a line near the bottom of the letter that she read 4 times before she put her coat on. Any structures on the property, including a barn identified in county records as sealed do not enter, will transfer with the land as is. Sealed, do not enter. She remembered that barn. She remembered it the way you remember a scar, not because you look at it every day, but because your hand still finds it in the dark. When she was 9 years old, her father had walked her up to that barn door, put a padlock on it the size of her fist, and told her that if she ever went near it again, she wouldn't like what happened next. He never explained why. 2 years later, her mother packed a station wagon in the middle of the night and drove Odessa and her baby brother Marsh 300 miles east, and that was the last either of them saw of Walton Hale until his obituary ran in the Ansel Creek Gazette. So when the auction came, Odessa drove the 3 hours out to the county courthouse steps, stood in a crowd of 11 other bidders, mostly land speculators, who wanted the acreage and didn't care about the house, and put in a number nobody wanted to beat. The opening bid was $12. Nobody raised it. The gavel came down, and just like that, Odessa Hale owned her father's farm outright for the price of a large pizza. She told herself she'd flip it, sell the acreage to whichever corn operation wanted to swallow it up, take whatever cash was left after the closing costs, and never think about Ansel Creek again. That plan lasted exactly 3 weeks. The house was worse than she remembered and somehow smaller, the way childhood places always are. Mice had gotten into the walls. A maple tree had grown up through a hole in the porch roof, patient as a decade. But the land itself, that was the part that surprised her. Even 6 years fallow, the topsoil out past the old machine shed was black and rich, the kind of dirt that farmers 2 counties over would drive out just to run their fingers through. Her father had never been much of a talker, but Odessa remembered him saying once, when she was small enough to still think he was the smartest man alive, that dirt like that took 4 generations to build and about 4 years to ruin, and that most people who owned it these days didn't understand which direction they were pushing it. She hired a local contractor named Gideon Strand to give her an honest read on what could be saved. Gideon had grown up 2 farms over, had a voice like gravel in a coffee can, and didn't waste words. House needs a new roof, new wiring, and somebody to deal with whatever's living in your crawl space," he told her on the first walkthrough. "Land's actually in decent shape for being asleep this long. Whoever farmed it last knew what they were doing, rotated it right before they let it go fallow. That's why the topsoil didn't blow off on you." He paused at the edge of the yard, looking toward the barn, and something in his face changed. "That barn, though, I'd leave that alone if I were you." "Why?" "Because everybody around here's got a theory about that barn, and none of them are good." That, of course, was the exact wrong thing to say to a woman who had just spent 3 weeks quietly rebuilding a life around a place she used to hate. Here's where I want to pause the story for a second, because this next part is the kind of thing that separates a farm that survives 100 years from one that gets swallowed up in 10, and it matters to what happens next. Old Midwest barns weren't just storage. Before rural electrification reached places like Ansel Creek in the late 1930s and 40s, a barn's construction told you everything about how a farm survived hard years. A well-built barn kept its northern wall solid against the wind, its loft ventilated just enough to cure hay without letting it mold and self-combust, which, by the way, is a real and surprisingly common cause of old barn fires. Hay that's baled too wet, generating enough internal heat to ignite on its own. And underneath a lot of these barns, especially ones built before home refrigeration was common, you'd find a root cellar or a seed cellar dug into the foundation, cool, dark, and dry, meant to keep a family's food and next year's planting seed alive through a winter that could kill both. Odessa didn't know any of this yet. She was about to learn it the hard way. The padlock on the barn door hadn't rusted through the way she expected. Someone had oiled it. Recently. That was the detail that stopped her cold, standing there in a light rain, 3 weeks after closing on the property, crowbar in hand. Nobody had set foot on this farm since her father died in April. So who kept the lock working? She called Gideon before she did anything else. "You're sure it's oiled?" he asked. "I'm sure." There was a long pause on the line. "There's a fella lives about 4 miles from you. Name of Osric Penny. Retired now, but he used to lease grazing rights on your daddy's back 40 years back, before your folks split up. If anybody's been quietly checking on this place, my money's on him. Might be worth a conversation before you go breaking locks." Odessa found Osric Penny sitting on his own porch that evening, an old man with hands like knotted rope, and when she told him her name, something in his face softened in a way that made her throat tight before he'd said a single word. "You look like your mother," he said. "Walton talked about you more than you'd think, considering he ran me off." "He didn't run you off, girl. Your mother left because she was scared, and she had good reason to be, but not the reason you're probably thinking." He waved her up onto the porch and told her to sit. "That barn. You want to know about that barn, or you want to keep swinging a crowbar at it and let the whole county keep gossiping about what your daddy was hiding?" She sat. What Osric told her took the better part of an hour, and it went back further than her father, further than her grandfather, back to 1936, the worst year of the Dust Bowl, when Odessa's great-grandfather, a man named Ambrose Hale, watched 3 years of drought turn Nebraska into something closer to the surface of the moon than farmland. Half the county packed up and went west. Ambrose didn't. Instead, according to Osric, Ambrose Hale had spent those brutal years doing something quietly unusual for the time, hand-selecting the hardiest, most drought-resistant ears from every corn crop he managed to save, year after year, and storing that seed, not the whole harvest, just the best of it, in a dugout seed cellar beneath what would later become the barn. This is a real practice, by the way, and it has a name, seed saving, and specifically what agricultural historians call landrace selection, breeding a crop, generation after generation, for resilience to your exact patch of land rather than for uniform size or yield. It's the same basic principle behind heirloom seed banks today, and organizations like the Seed Savers Exchange exist specifically because so much of that genetic diversity nearly disappeared once industrial hybrid seed took over American farming in the mid-20th century. A lot of the corn grown across the Midwest today comes from a genetically narrow set of commercial hybrids, which makes it incredibly productive in good years, and dangerously vulnerable if the wrong blight or drought ever hits at the wrong time, because there's so little variation left to fall back on. Odessa Hale, without ever reading a paper on the subject, had understood that instinctively. And by the time he died in 1961, he'd built up a seed line unique to that one farm corn that had survived the worst drought in American history and kept getting better at surviving it, plus a smaller stock of heirloom beans and squash his wife had kept alongside it, seeds that existed nowhere else on earth. He passed the responsibility to Odessa's grandfather. Her grandfather passed it to Walton. And Walton's stubborn, closed-off, hard-to-love Walton had spent 30 years quietly guarding a seed vault that a corn syndicate out of Lincoln had been trying to buy, pressure, and eventually threaten him out of since the early 1990s, because a drought-hardened, disease-resistant, genetically unique corn line is worth a fortune to the right buyer, and an enormous liability to a farmer who just wants to be left alone. He locked that barn because men came around asking questions that weren't really questions, Osric said. Because your daddy got a call once, telling him a fire might be an accident that happens to stubborn old farmers. He didn't tell your mama the details, just told her to take you kids somewhere safe. She thought he was the danger. He was trying to keep the danger away from you. Odessa sat with that for a long time, before she went back to the barn. She didn't use the crowbar. Osric had a key. Walton had given him a copy years ago, the one person he trusted enough. Inside, past a barn floor gone soft with dust, a trapdoor led down into a seed cellar, exactly the way old-timers used to build them. Fieldstone walls, a temperature that stayed close to 55 degrees year-round without a single watt of electricity, and rows of glass jars and cloth seed sacks, each one labeled in 3 generations of handwriting. Ambrose's cramped pencil. Her grandfather's blocky capitals, Walton's, in the last few years, shaky but careful. The most recent jar was labeled in her father's hand, dated 8 months before he died, for if she ever comes back for it. Not the farm, the seed. He'd been leaving it for her the whole time. Odessa didn't sell the acreage to the corn operation. She didn't sell it to anyone. With Gideon's help and, eventually, Osric's, she got 3 acres back into production the following spring, not row after row of a single hybrid, but her great-grandfather's corn, planted the old way, tended the old way, the same genetic line that survived 1936, quietly going back into ground that remembered it. She still works the warehouse job in Omaha 2 days a week. She hasn't figured out the rest yet, but she kept the barn standing and the lock stayed off it. And every August now, she drives back out to Ansel Creek to watch corn that's older than the state's oldest living resident come up green out of dirt her family fought 4 generations not to lose. The seed bank is documented now, registered with a regional heirloom preservation network, so that no single locked barn will ever again be the only thing standing between 100 years of careful selection and losing it for good. That's the real ending here, and it's worth sitting with. An entire piece of American agricultural history almost vanished because one stubborn man was too scared to explain himself, and it survived anyway, because his daughter finally asked why. If this story hit you the way it hit me putting it together, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of a Montana rancher who found something under his hay barn that the State Geological Survey still hasn't fully explained. You will not want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.